You're listening to A Cloth-Wrapped Kernel on Mr.Liddle'sHistoryBites. When I was at university as an undergraduate, I distinctly remember one of the last days in my second World History Survey course with Dr. Luke Roberts. Dr. Roberts is a specialist in Japanese history, and he decided to wrap up the class by asking us a sort of send-off question. He asked the class to consider what was the most critical revolution of the last 300 years in human history. I remember everybody naming off the revolutions in the Americas, France, Russia. But Dr. Roberts said think a little bit broader. Some people named off lesser-known revolutions, such as the Iranian or the Mexican revolutions, but Dr. Roberts still said he didn't think these were the most important revolutions. And he made a case that the Industrial Revolution, the political, social, cultural, and economic revolution, was actually the greatest revolution of the last 300 years. In my time since that class, I have come to agree with Dr. Roberts. The Industrial Revolution was the largest and most important revolution in the last 300 years. The short and long-term impacts of the Industrial Revolution are mind-bogglingly complex, from the way we live to what we eat to how we work, our individual circadian rhythms, forest cover on the planet's surface, and the mass extinction of animals on par with any previous mass extinction. All of these developments can be attributed to the Industrial Revolution. In short, whether you think it was a net negative or a net positive, the Industrial Revolution has had the largest impact in the last 300 years of human history. One thing to keep in mind is the Industrial Revolution is a process and not a single event. And something as society-changing and complex as the Industrial Revolution could not possibly be completely explained in a 15-minute video. This video will focus on the global circumstances that helped lead to England's Industrial Revolution. In this, we will seek to answer the questions of why England first, and how do non-economic factors contribute to this fundamental shift. A quick overview from any basic history textbook will provide you with a list of reasons why England was the first place in the world to make the shift to industrialization. These usually include factors such as easily accessible coal deposits, canals and waterways, a history of scientific research, and a stable government, and a degree of free market principles in society. All of this is correct, of course. These are some of the necessary inputs to make the shift to industrialization. But students of world history will note that almost all of these could also apply to China as well. Which leads to the famous question of why not China, the country that has led the world in technological development for so many centuries? Yet China did not make the shift to industrialization. This question actually has a name. It's called the Needham puzzle, first coined by British historian and scientist Joseph Needham in 1969. There are many possible answers to the Needham puzzle, and we cannot go into detail about all of them here, but I would like to point out one answer put forward by the Chinese economist Justin Yifu Lin, who focused on the development of the scientific method, which he describes, quote, as the shift to experiment-based technological invention and the closer integration of sciences and technology arising from the scientific revolution in the 17th century. And furthermore, he wrote that, quote, while the experimental method had been used to invent technology, even in ancient times, the popularization of the experiment as a vehicle for inventing new technology was a phenomenon that emerged only after the scientific revolution. And this is one reason why England and Europe in particular was primed to make the jump from agricultural to industrial society. However, having addressed one of the uniquely European aspects, let us take a more global view, examining contributing factors which, while taking place outside of England, specifically in the Americas and South Asia, nonetheless contributed to England's Industrial Revolution. We'll first take a look at the Americas, specifically the colonies in Canada and on the east coast of the future United States, were to play two critical roles in Britain's industrialization. One in a more abstract way, and one in a more concrete fashion. In the abstract, the Americas, their colonization, and the economic opportunity of raw materials and perceived open space meant some enterprising British merchants got fabulously wealthy. For example, Edward Colston, the Bristol-born merchant who financed a number of philanthropic ventures and was elected to Parliament several times, earned much of his wealth via the trade with Africa and the Americas. Some merchants who would later go on to invest in some early industrial machinery and factories, as well as sponsor some of the agricultural developments that would lead to the Industrial Revolution. As the Caribbean-born historian Eric Williams has pointed out, quote, by 1750 there was hardly a trading or manufacturing town in England which was not in some way connected with the triangular or direct colonial trade. The profits obtained provided the main streams of accumulated capital that financed England's Industrial Revolution. The construction of industrial works factories, and machines all takes a great deal of money, as well as a great deal of economic certainty. The combination of wealthy merchants from trade with the Americas in tobacco, cotton, sugar, and slaves would be the source of capital, and the British government, with its limited reach and respect for private property, lent a degree of certainty that investors desired. In the more concrete sense of the word, the American colonies served as a sort of breadbasket for England. Carrying capacity is a term that refers to how many people a given plot of land can support. The population limit, if you will. This is the amount of food that can be produced within a given area. Even if on a good year a lot of food happens to be produced, a bad year tends to even it out. If more people happen to be born than the carry capacity can support, there will be starvation and the population will shrink. This is also referred to as a Malthusian limit, after the philosopher Thomas Malthus, who theorized the idea. It is a very popular concept when discussing topics such as overpopulation. However, I would be remiss if I didn't point out humans are very capable of breaking Malthusian limits. There were only 1 billion people when Thomas Malthus put forward his idea, and now we are at 7 billion. The Americas helped England overcome its Malthusian limit by being a source of food that could be imported and support a larger population than had previously been able to exist. Additionally, some of those foods were much more calorie dense, such as the potato or maize, aka corn. Some of you may be aware of how important potatoes would later become to the Irish diet, to give one example. The combination of an enriched diet and a general increase in the food supply meant that England's population could grow and would eventually serve as a labor force in the newly industrialized state. Historians and scholars refer to this trend of the Americas providing an extra source of food as ghost acreage, meaning that the land that England would need to support a population for industrial development did not actually have to be within England itself. Of course, all of this goes hand in hand with agricultural developments within England itself. For example, there's the political economic development known as the enclosure movement, which had been going on for about 200 years by 1750. Essentially, the enclosure movement was the accumulation of private land by wealthy landowners and aristocrats who sought to maximize their returns on the land. A fancy way of saying, grow the most food for the least amount of land. For example, the British politician Charles Townshend pioneered a new system of crop rotation to maximize turnip production to feed more animals. This enclosure of the commons was done either by stripping peasants of their traditional rights to the land or straight up buying it from them. Taken together as a source of capital and as a source of food, one cannot ignore the role the American territories of the British Empire played when asking the question of why England was the start of the Industrial Revolution. These alone are not enough to explain the revolution's origins in England, however. Recall that China also had a large population and hyper-efficient agriculture, so to get a fuller picture, another element must be explored. Food is a critical element, but it's important to remember that the Industrial Revolution begins with the mechanization of the textile industry. The evolution of small household production of textiles to that of massive looms in factories powered by running water. This fact is well established, but this fact alone does not explain the time frame or the reason why mechanization first occurred in this industry. To understand this, we must again take a global view, this time of cotton textiles. By the 1750s, the most commonly traded item across the world was without a doubt cotton textiles, and by far the largest producer of cotton textiles was the region known as South Asia, and in particular, the region known as Bengal, which corresponds roughly to the modern nation of Bangladesh. The textiles produced there, their color and designs, were so popular that this cloth was demanded more than any other product in return for human cargo shipped from West Africa during the Atlantic slave trade. It was demanded in the Americas, even after the 13 colonies gained their independence. It was replicated in France and labeled as coming from, quote, India, so people would know that it came from Bengal, one of the earliest forms of false advertising. On a relative scale, despite being imported all the way from Asia, around the coast of Africa, these textiles were within the financial reach of many individuals in the upper and burgeoning middle and merchant classes. What explains this? Part of the answer lies in the vast population and highly efficient agriculture of the Bengal region, in specific, but South Asia in general. Essentially, workers were paid a very low wage in South Asia, but that did not matter because food was so cheap, you didn't need to make a lot of money to survive. Weaving was also strictly regulated as a profession, but it came with a high level of respect and esteem. Many people aspired to be weavers. Whole families were in the weaving business, and weaving machines known as charka could be seen throughout the region, used by an individual or in a group, in an early form of textile mechanization. For all of these reasons, even having to ship them all the way around the coast of Africa, these textiles from South Asia were even cheaper than those produced in Europe. And back in Europe, these South Asian textiles were having quite the impact. Throughout the early 1600s and into the 1700s, a number of riots took place in London. These riots were led by weavers demanding that the English government do something about the influx of textiles from South Asia, and especially about the English East India Company's dumping of these textiles into England. They claimed that these cheap imports would destroy their livelihoods. They even went so far as to attack the East India Company headquarters in London in the course of a single riot. The English Parliament, in response, took up action and passed a series of measures known as the Calico Acts. Active until 1774, the Calico Acts were part of the larger mercantilist policy followed by most European nations at the time, designed to concentrate wealth in the mother country. There were several different Calico laws, but they all shared a common feature. They sought to limit the number of imported textiles in England. Of course, it didn't actually hurt the business of the East India Company. They continued to trade textiles from South Asia in Africa and the Americas. However, it was the efficiency of production of these South Asian textiles that was a driving force to seek out an alternative to traditional production methods and contributed to the Industrial Revolution. The dates help explain this story. Some of the major inventions that mechanized the textile production in England in the 1700s, such as the flying shuttle in 1773, which increased the speed at which yarn could be transformed into cloth, as well as the spinning jenny in 1764 and the water frame in 1769, both increased the efficiency of transforming cotton into yarn. All of these inventions were invented, improved upon, and diffused throughout England during a time when England was protected from Bengal-produced textiles by the Calico Acts. The Scottish journalist Francis Espinasse wrote a history of the Lancashire textile industry in 1874, acknowledged that, quote, "If woolen manufacturers had not for their own ends procured a prohibition of Indian textiles, it is possible there never would have been a cotton manufacturing in this country. It might have been strangled by the import and competition of cheap cotton products from India." This story seems to offer us a lesson in the power of private enterprise and market forces. When costs are high, individuals will always look for ways to cheapen them. And if one avenue for acquiring cheaper goods, such as imports, are closed off, they may look for a different path. And in this case, that path was mechanization. While mechanization of production had existed in small scales across the globe at this point in history, this time it was different. This time, the combination of the European scientific revolution and the close connection between industry and government meant that this mechanization would spread and would be supported, tacitly and openly, by the government. This is why the Industrial Revolution is different. And I find it quite interesting that the doctrine of free trade, that would be taken up so militantly by Great Britain later on to sell its industrial goods worldwide, was only made possible because of a protectionist, mercantilist policy that helped Great Britain to industrialize in the first place. In an odd twist of history, once England had industrialized, they began to dump cheap cotton cloth into India. A combination of the East India Company, which ruled most of South Asia by this point, and their taxation policy, which was proving ruinous to the local weaving industry, and the demand for cotton as a raw material, shifted South Asian production away from producing completed textiles to producing the inputs for textiles, aka cotton. There is a reason that Mahatma Gandhi, in his protests against British rule in India, spun his own cloth. He knew that one pillar of British rule over India was their destruction of local Indian textile production. After considering these two examples from both the Americas and South Asia, one is almost forced to consider the connection between the Industrial Revolution and colonialism. After all, both South Asia and the Americas were tightly bound to England, in part because of its overseas empire. Historians like to divide world history to make it easier to understand certain time periods. Usually, the Industrial Revolution is separated from the age of colonialism, because that came before it. But considering these connections, was the Industrial Revolution only possible because of the development of overseas empires by England? Should it be included in the age of colonialism? It is most appropriate to take a global view of the Industrial Revolution, no matter where it began. Almost every person on Earth today lives in an industrial society, or a society that is heavily influenced and shaped by a nearby industrial society. In order to understand our global situation, it is important to take a look at the history of that situation through a global lens. I want to thank you for joining me. I hope you've learned something, but I also hope you walk away with a few questions. This is Mr. Little, and I will see you next time.